The story get started.
Besides, it sounds like Janet has started in the other room. I don't want to shout her out. Well, welcome to the class about the history of the devil. It feels good to be back in the classroom again. I don't think I have taught a class since it was over Zoom during the pandemic. And it feels good to be alive again. So this is great. Thank you all for coming. As we were talking before I got started here, I've been interested in this subject for quite a while. And about a year ago, I started reading some books on the subject, and I thought I'd share what I learned with all of you. So thank you for coming. We're experimenting here. I believe this is the first time we've tried to record a class here in this room. So we'll see how it goes. I hope it works out all right. At least my wife is looking forward to watching it later because she's teaching confirmation class right now, and she's always disappointed when she doesn't get a chance to attend an adult education class. So we'll see how the recording goes. The history of the devil. I included a quote from one of the authors that I'm going to be talking about today. Good is good only because there is evil, and God is God because there is a devil. I pulled from the book, The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil by Paul Karras. So, I don't know what you think about that. We're not going to discuss that particular quote today, but if you're philosophically inclined, you can take that home and do some pondering on it. See what you think about that.
Well,
I'm not sure.
I'd let it jump up like that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I'm not sure what I think about that. It's certainly a dualistic thinking, right? But oh well. I mean, you can say, I gotta say something about it. You know, the dualism bothers me a little bit because, for instance, people say, well, cold is just the absence of heat, right? But try telling that to someone who's freezing to death, right? I don't know. Anyway, moving on. These are our class sessions looking ahead, just so here's what to expect here. Today we're going to be talking about ideas of evil in ancient societies. Devil worship, sacrifice, etc., even in the pre-biblical days. Next week, and I know I'm going to slip up and I'll say, well, next week in our class, we'll ignore that. We're not going to have a class next week. Come and attend the Earth Care Fair. We'll have tables set up and activities, even for kids. We'll have some things for kids to enjoy. April 23rd, the day after Earth Day, April 23rd will be Earth Care Sunday here. 2 weeks from today, ideas of evil in the Old Testament. Now, when I say Old Testament, I really mean the Protestant Old Testament. You're probably aware that the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christian churches have more books in their Old Testament. And the week after that, I'm going to be talking about the devil in intertestamental writings, because in the Protestant Old Testament, Satan, you know, we have two words, right? Satan and devil. We have two words because in the Old Testament, that was originally written in Hebrew. New Testament was written in Greek. Well, Satan is from a Hebrew word. Devil is from a Greek word. Because we have two different languages, we have two different words. That's why we have two different words, two different languages. But in the Old Testament, not much is said about Satan. And then in the New Testament, all of a sudden, we've got this evil devil tempting Jesus. Well, where did that come from? We have to look at these intertestamental writings to understand where this concept of the New Testament devil came from. So we'll be looking at, we call them apocryphal writings. The Roman Catholic Church calls them deuterocanonical, second canon. May 14th, the devil in the New Testament. The Gospels treat the devil in slightly different ways, and we'll take a look at that. And then May 21st, the devil in more modern times. Now, not exactly today, but in years after New Testament times, including, and I'm going to be talking about these books, but in a minute. But Elaine Pagels writes a very good book about how we've used devil and demon symbolism to demonize people we don't necessarily like. For example, during World War II, German propaganda contained devilish images of Jewish people. But it worked on both sides. American propaganda contained devilish images of Japanese. So both sides were guilty. So we're going to look a little bit about that and other things on May 21st. So that's what to expect as we go along here. Now the books. The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil by Paul Karras. I'm going to read a little bit about, from the back covers of these books, about these people. I want to give credit where credit is due. Paul Karras was a pioneering author and thinker of the early 20th century. He became the first managing editor of the Open Court Publishing Company, which aimed to provide for the discussion of philosophy, science, and religion, and to make philosophical classics widely available by making them affordable. As an author, he published 75 books and 1,500 articles. Prolific author. So one of the things I want to point out is this book is, thank you. Come on in.
And the devil locked that door on me?
The devil made me do it.
I can sit somewhere else. We can move down. I'll sit from there.
Sorry, I didn't realize that was locked when I closed it. Pat asked me yesterday if I was going to show a clip of Flip Wilson's comedy act, The Devil Made Me Do It. I forgot all about that. I should have set up a clip of that.
Modern times. Yeah, your last week.
So one point I wanted to make is this book is over 100 years old. Okay, so it and it shows sometimes, including referring to primitive societies sometimes as savages. It's not really very politically correct, but it has some good data in it anyway. The next book is The Historical and Theological Evolution of Satan, the Devil, and Hell by Charles River Editors. The back cover says Charles River Editors was founded by Harvard and MIT alumni to provide superior editing and original writing services with the expertise to create digital content for publishers across a vast range of subject matter. In addition to providing original digital content for third-party publishers, Charles River Editors republishes civilization's greatest literary works, bringing them to a new generation via ebooks. The Origin of Satan, How Christians Demonize Jews, Pagans, and Heretics by Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels is Harrington Spear Payne Professor of Religion at Princeton University. Professor Pagels received her doctorate from Harvard University in 1970 and taught at Barnard College, where she chaired the Department of Religion, and also taught at Columbia University. She has written several other books, including The Gnostic Gospels, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the National Book Award. So, giving credit where credit is due. The ideal of evil in ancient societies. The worship of evil was probably the first stage in the evolution of religion. Evil worship, appeasement of evil. Why? Because We fear the bad, not the good. When ancient peoples experienced natural disasters, storms, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, it was only natural for them to try to perform rituals for the appeasement of whatever was causing these natural disasters. That was probably the first form of religious observances. They often involve sacrifices, sometimes human. I want to talk a little bit about cannibalism, even though the cannibalism wasn't strictly a sacrifice, but the connection to religion will be apparent in a few seconds. Cannibalism was not the result of a shortage of food. It wasn't really a religious ritual. It was consuming a victim to acquire the virtues of the dead, maybe the strength of the victim or the intelligence or the wiles of the victim. There are remnants even today. We ritually consume the flesh and blood of Jesus to receive eternal life. The followers, it maybe sound uncomfortable to us, it was especially uncomfortable to the followers of Jesus. Take a look at John chapter 6. Gotta sit down for a minute here to get to my mouse. This is Bible Gateway, ignore the ads. Bible Gateway is free to use, but they make you look at ads. John 6, starting with, I'll read it to you because we aren't going to be able to read that. John 6, starting in verse 54. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. And then skipping ahead here to verse 60, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? Verse 66, because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. This was especially confusing to the Jews who he was speaking to, because to the Jews, consuming any kind of blood from any kind of an animal would violate Jewish dietary laws. They weren't permitted to consume blood from any animal. So that's the reason I put in cannibalism here, because there's a little bit of a connection to religion. Now, we have to talk about child sacrifice in connection with these primitive cultures. The reason we need to talk about it is because it comes up in the Old Testament. It's a mistake to think that the Israelites were always monotheistic and always worshipped only Yahweh, right? They were surrounded by the Canaanites. Those were their neighbors, and the Canaanites were definitely polytheistic and sometimes engaged in things like child sacrifice. And the Israelites often borrowed the practices of their neighbors, sad to say. Not even the Israelites were immune. I'll just go through some I'm not going to get heavily into the Old Testament today, but just to show you what the practices were of the primitive peoples of that time that I might say infected the Israelite religion. There were laws that attempted to ban these practices. We can look at Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the original law in Leviticus, and then Deuteronomy, which means second giving of the law. They tried twice. Leviticus 18:21, you shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Molech was a Canaanite god, sometimes attributed to the Ammonites, but more generally to the Canaanites. And in Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law, 18:10, no one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire, or who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer. Laws attempting to ban the practice of child sacrifice. Now, even kings were guilty. King Solomon, supposedly very wise, but he was not really. 1 Kings 11:7, then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. King Ahaz, 2 Kings 16:3, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. I should say something about what's wrong with walking in the ways of the kings of Israel. Now, after Solomon's reign, the United Kingdom of Israel split in two. The northern kingdom was still called Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah. So with King Ahaz, now we're talking about after the split. King Ahaz was the king of the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians and wiped out, never to be a political entity again. The people of Judah attributed the destruction of the kingdom of Israel to their apostasy and falling away from God. They blamed the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel for leading people astray. So, when the writers in Judah, of course, history is written by the survivors, right? And it's the people of Judah were the ones who survived. So when an author from the kingdom of Judah writes about one of our kings followed in the way of the kings of Israel, that's a slam, right? That's what this is all about. Walked in the way of the kings of Israel, he made his son pass through the fire, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the people of Israel. King Manasseh, 2 Kings 21:6. He made his son pass through fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury and dealt with mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. The prophets spoke out against this practice, particularly Jeremiah. I have 3 passages from Jeremiah I found. 7:31, and they go on building the high place of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom. This is east of Jerusalem, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. 19:5, and gone on building the high places of Baal, to burn their children in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or decree, nor did it enter my mind. 32:35, and built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to offer up their sons and daughters to Molech, though I did not command them, nor did it enter my mind that they should do this abomination, causing Judah to sin. So, that's an overview of this apparently very common practice of child sacrifice among the Israelites in the Old Testament that apparently they picked up from their neighbors, the Canaanites.
Question, wasn't Isaac almost sacrificed?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the very near sacrifice of Isaac by the hand of his father seems shocking to us, but look at this, it might not have been very shocking to Abraham. right? That's a good point, a good point.
Was that a test of his faith?
Yeah, I think it was, see, God knew what Abraham was going to do, right? The test of Abraham's faith was for Abraham's benefit. See, Abraham had to know how strong his faith was. God knew, right? It wasn't for God's benefit. It was for Abraham's benefit, because Abraham had to become aware of how strong his faith really was. At least that's my opinion.
Did this, so this is a practice that they adopted from other religions in the area.
Yes.
So did they do this in times of stress or was it more routine?
I think it was probably, well, here's the way it was explained to me for the reasons why they did that. Now, this is from, you brought up the Crossways classes. Well, the instructor that I learned Crossways from, here's how he explained it to me about how they picked up these practices from their neighbors. See, the Israelites came up out of Egypt. When they were in Egypt, the Nile flooded every year and produced fertile land for them to grow crops. Now, they relocated to the Promised Land where they didn't have that yearly flooding, right? They had to depend on rainfall. Well, sometimes it doesn't rain. So they had to look to their neighbors for, how do you grow crops here in a land like this? And their neighbors explained, well, the storm god up in the sky gets it on with the earth mother god in the earth, and it rains down from heaven and fertilizes the ground and the crops grow. And the Israelites said, well, what happens when it doesn't rain? And the Canaanites said, well, we go into the temple with the temple prostitutes and we show the gods what to do. And that's what, they, during times of drought, their families were starving. What would you do to feed your family, right? And according to the guy who taught me the Crossways class, that was the reason that they adopted these practices. It was a point of desperation in these times.
I'm wondering also about the children, the child sacrifice. I think famine was such an issue that I'm thinking of the children that are like left out on the wall to die.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that might have been influenced by a lack of food.
That could be by the lack of food. And the fact is, in that society, children were valued even less than women were. Sad to say. And we saw here that Solomon was a participant in this child sacrifice thing. Well, hate to say it, but Solomon had so many wives and concubines, he had children to spare. I mean, I hate to say it, but, anyway. Well, after all of that, that's a real downer, right? We need some comic relief. I found a cartoon about sacrifice from Gary Larson and the Far Side. You probably can't read this, so I will read it to you. Here are some savages carrying two women up the side of an erupting volcano. One woman says to the other, "Ha, and you were worried that they wouldn't like Americans. Why, these people just lit up when I explained we were Virginians." All right, but seriously, folks.
I'm never gonna say that.
Okay, let's look at some examples of now ancient civilizations. Before we were talking about really mainly pre-civilizations, just tribes, right? So now we're going to move in talking about large civilizations in that area, in the area of the Middle East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and so forth. Okay, ancient Egypt. They had over 1,500 gods and goddesses. How did they keep them all straight? I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about all of them. Don't worry. But I'll just talk about a few major ones, and then we'll focus on one in particular, the one that became the symbol of evil. Anubis carries the dead to judgment in the underworld. Horus, god of the sky, kingship, healing, son of Osiris and Isis. Isis, goddess of funerary rites, motherhood, protection, and magic. Wife of Osiris and mother of Horus. Sometimes Horus is just called Hor, just H-O-R. Osiris, god of fertility, agriculture, the afterlife, the dead, resurrection, life, and vegetation. Ra, the sun god. You may have heard of Ra before. Set, god of deserts, storms, disorder, and violence. All right, just a few, and we're going to focus on the last one. As Egyptian civilization developed, Set, the last one, became known as an evil god and eventually, frankly, just a demon. Set, from god to demon. How did that happen? Set was god of the desert. He was, in fact, worshipped as a god west of the Nile, in the desert region west of the Nile, which was very dry. In that area, it was to their advantage to keep on the good side of the god of the desert, right? So they worshipped him there, not so much along the Nile. Osiris was the popular god along the fertile region next to the Nile. Set was increasingly seen as opposed to Osiris. Set was seen as the god of the desert, sucking the life out of vegetation, which was Osiris. In one myth, Set murders Osiris, but Osiris is resurrected in his son Horus. There was a rise in the worship of Osiris, especially along the population centers next to the Nile. As there came to be a rise in the worship of Osiris, Set came to be regarded as an evil demon, the devil of Egypt. So much so that the names of ancient kings were changed. They went back and changed records, official records. Because when Set was a god that was worshipped, kings took the name of Set and made it a part of the king's name, like Set-necht, for example. Well, when Set was demonized, they went back and changed the records to take Set out of the name, sort of like if Christ somehow should become a name, somebody might go back and change Christiansen to take out the word Christ, right? From Egypt to Akkad and the early Semites. We need some definitions here. Akkad was the capital of the ancient Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia after the long-lived civilization of Sumer. You've probably heard about the Sumerians. The Akkadians came after the Sumerians. Semites. First, I mentioned one of the books is over 100 years old. The term Semites is not used much anymore. It's an obsolete term. We still say anti-Semitic. We still say Semitic languages in linguistics. But as an ethnic, cultural, or racial group, it's considered to be an obsolete term now. It's largely not used in that context anymore. It's considered a little bit racially charged these days, but that, of course, 100 years ago, it was different. But what the book means is groups such as Assyrians, Babylonians, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews, Arameans. Those are the groups under the term Semites. Now, we need a map. So you need to understand where these people all were. This is a map that locates some of these groups, although these groups didn't exist at the same time. Here it shows the Sumerians down here, but that was a very old civilization. They didn't exist at the same time as the Babylonians or the Akkadians or the Assyrians. So in fact, we're not even going to cover those, too old. But you can see, and the Akkadians existed before the Babylonians and the Assyrians, right? But here you can see where Akkad, the capital of the Akkadian Empire, was. See Babylon, the capital of the Babylonians. The Assyrians were up here with their capital Nineveh. Make a note of where the Persians were to the east. Egyptians, you know where Egypt is. Unfortunately, this doesn't show other Semitic peoples. Over here, the Israelites, Canaanites. On the other side of the Jordan River, the Moabites, Ammonites, Arameans up here to the north of the Israelites. The Arameans were in an area that today is called Syria. Also notice, don't be confused, today's Syria is different than the Assyrian Empire in ancient times. Very easy to be confused. Assyria was an ancient empire here in the north. Today's Syria is in this area next to the Mediterranean Sea today. All right. You get the lay of the land? Okay, let's...
Do we have to take a test on that?
Okay, now back to the text. Akkad and the early Semites. Many Semitic beliefs and customs were of Akkadian origin, the older Akkadians. In particular, Babylonian and Assyrian ideas came from Akkadian ideas. For instance, where do we get 7 days in a week? If we look back, that's an Akkadian idea. They had 7 days in a week with a day of rest on the seventh day. That comes from Akkadian culture. They had a tree of life symbol. They had a legend in their culture of a great flood. There was a fertile land west of the Euphrates River called Edena. You might notice that sounds a lot like Eden. I can't prove that it was connected, but boy, it sure sounds like it might be. We can see some Babylonian legends. After the Akkadians, there were the Babylonians. We can see some Babylonian legends in the Old Testament. The Akkadians passed their legend of the Great Flood on to the Babylonians, and that appears in the Old Testament. The Babylonians had a story about the Tower of Babel. There's an Assyrian word called Babyloni, which means gate of God. There may be a connection there. Again, I can't prove it, but it's interesting to know. There's a Babylonian story about corrupt cities destroyed by a rain of fire. What Old Testament story might that be connected to?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah. Exactly. Another connection, birth of King Sargon I, an Akkadian legend. Well, Sargon was not the legend. Sargon I was the first king of the Akkadian Empire. But the legend is connected with his birth. This legend is spelled out in the book Babylonian Life and History by Wallace Budge, page 40 of that book. He writes, a curious legend is extant respecting this king to the effect that he was born in a city on the banks of the Euphrates, that his mother conceived him in secret and brought him forth in a humble place, that she placed him in an ark of rushes and closed it with pitch, that she cast him upon the river in the watertight ark, that he was rescued by a man called Aki, who brought him up to his own trade, and that from this position the goddess Ishtar made him king. Elements of this ancient Akkadian legend appear in what Old Testament story?
Moses.
Moses.
Yeah.
Fascinating. At least I think this is all very fascinating. Okay, now I should stop once in a while for questions. Any questions about Egypt, Akkadia, Babylonia, Assyria? Or should we proceed? Next, we need to talk about, oh yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm going to assume that the knowledge that we have, the history of this,
Yes.
is word of mouth, was not written down. Or am I wrong?
That's not entirely correct.
Okay.
A lot of this comes from carvings on stone tablets,
Oh,
archaeological evidence. These authors, particularly this book by Paul Karras, The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil, he references many archaeologists and other historical authors who have actually interpreted the carvings on these stone monuments and other archaeological evidence.
But the same is true also for the non-Israelite things. I mean, you're talking about it kind of from our perspective, but what you were talking about earlier was from their perspective, and there's evidence of their perspective in writings as well.
Yes,
right?
yeah, sure. Every author has an agenda, right? And so, right.
Steve, how often is that changed because of the winners write the history?
Well, exactly.
I mean, the history, and then all of a sudden, 50 years later, somebody else does, I don't like that history, so I'm gonna change it.
yeah,
I
well,
mean, that, how many times did that history get changed, good or bad?
Yeah.
We don't know what the truth is.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly part of it, I'm sure. Although, it's easier to change things today, I think, than it was to change stone tablets.
Didn't have the zip drive back then?
Yeah. I mean, these days, all you need is a Twitter account, right?
Plus archaeology, that was 100 years ago, that was written.
Yes.
We have more archaeological sites since then.
And many more, yeah, that's true. Yeah, more being discovered all the time.
And I will say that in Old Testament studies, for centuries, these, myths from other Babylonia, there's scholars who've known that these were woven into, maybe not particularly studying about the devil, but just these, the Moses story has been part of the understanding of biblical scholars. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
So it's not new so much.
Yeah, right. But even with biblical studies, we're learning more all the time. I mean, when Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1945, which long after that book was written.
Yeah. New scrolls.
Yes. Okay, I want to make sure we get to Persian dualism. This is very important and equally fascinating. Okay. Persian dualism. So, Zoroastrianism. That's a $20 word. It needs some explanation. Zoroastrianism was a Persian/Iranian religion. Lasted from about 650 BCE. Oh, by the way, do you know the terms BCE and CE? They replaced the older terms BC and AD, right? BCE is before the Common Era, and CE is Common Era, right? They replaced, because the terms of before Christ and in the year of our Lord aren't quite right. Jesus was born somewhere between 6 and 4 BCE, so to say before Christ it just doesn't fit quite right. And besides, when we're studying history with Jewish scholars, those old terms don't really mean anything to them. So BCE and CE. Zoroastrianism began in about 650 BCE, and starting in the 600s, 600 CE is probably a little too early. During the 600 CE is when Islam started to come to the front, and of course today Iran is an Islamic country. So Islam replaced Zoroastrianism. It was founded by the prophet Zoroaster, actually in his language, which was Avestan. He was known as Zarathustra. Theology. Their god was called Ahura Mazda, the word of light or wisdom. The evil one was Angramaynu, or in later writings, Ahriman, the destructive spirit. Notice where we've come from here. We've come from devil worship through Egypt with 1,500 gods and goddesses to Persian dualism with a good god, good spirit, and an evil spirit, just two. Okay? Notice the evolution here. The struggle between these two principles of good and of evil constitute the world's history, according to Zoroastrianism. Some Zoroastrian beliefs. At the end of time, a final battle between good and evil will be fought, punctuated by evil's final assault. The great Savior, the Thaoshant, will be born to a virgin, impregnated with the seed of Zoroaster. The Savior will bring about the resurrection of the dead. The living will become immortal, their bodies transfigured. The forces of good will ultimately triumph over evil. These are some of the Zoroastrian beliefs. And again, think about how some of these Zoroastrian beliefs may have made their way into later religions.
Sounds like the New Testament.
It does, doesn't it? Keep in mind, given those dates that I gave earlier, compare them with the dates of the Babylonian exile and the return from the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile ended when King Cyrus of Persia defeated Babylonia, and the Jews were allowed to return, were allowed by the Persians to return from exile and return to Judah. That's about the same time as the rise of Zoroastrianism. It's certainly feasible that they took back with them some Zoroastrian ideas, and if not then, the Persians controlled that whole area for 200 years after that, until Alexander the Great conquer that region for Greece. So there's plenty of time for exchange of ideas between the Jews and the Persians. I'm going to end on a somewhat light note, but any questions about what I've talked about so far before we end it? I ended on purpose with Persian dualism, a good spirit, a bad spirit, and the struggle for control of the world, because 2 weeks from today, when we take this up again, I'll talk about the beliefs of the Israelites in the Old Testament, and we'll pick up that theme then. Any questions so far?
Just a comment. I'm thinking of the wise men who followed the star
Yes.
to worship the baby Jesus, and that all just comes to mind as we think about Zoroastrian beliefs.
Yes, there is a Zoroastrian legend that it was a prediction of Zoroaster that caused them to travel from Persia to seek out the baby Jesus. Just a legend, but who knows? Anything else? Okay, I'm gonna end on something I think is really fascinating here. This is an ad from an issue of Popular Science Monthly from 1917. This is an ad for a GE light bulb, brand name Mazda. They trademarked this brand name in 1909. It was a tungsten filament light bulb to replace the previous carbon filament light bulb, which had been the standard ever since Thomas Edison invented it. Now, what I would like to know, I would sure love to know more about this story. What I would like to know is who on the GE marketing team knew enough about Persian gods to know that the Zoroastrian god of light was Ahura Mazda. So they could name their new light bulb Mazda. I don't know. I remember when, after my dad's mother passed away, we were cleaning out her house. I found one of these old light bulbs in her attic. I think I still have it. When I was putting together this class, I remembered it, and so I did a Google search for Mazda light bulbs, and this ad popped up. So I just had to share it.
And where did Japan get Mazda?
Yeah, I don't know where they got it, but they entered into an agreement with GE, because when they came out with that car, GE still owned the trademark. They entered into an agreement so that the car company could use the Mazda trademark for automotive purposes, and GE still owned it for non-automotive purposes. That is until the year 2000, when GE's trademark expired entirely.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Stay tuned.